So let's get started. Can you tell us how you selected and what brought you to Michigan Tech?
Sure, but firstly, thank you all for your attendance and participation coming tonight. In particular, thanks to my longtime friend, Jen Young-Lucas. We met many years ago as wee little sophomore juniors at Michigan Tech. I'll speak a little bit more about that connection. So, events like this aren't easy to pull off. Obviously, there's a lot of logistics and planning and so forth. And as was mentioned, she's standing up a new series here, so appreciation there. And thank you for agreeing to moderate and hopefully keep me in line with my commentary and keep it relatively interesting. We'll see. But on that note, if I'm not interesting and you don't feel like the price of admission was worthwhile, again, direct your complaints to Jen, okay? I want to say a commentary on just the relationship. Obviously, a lot of folks from Milwaukee Tool here, and the collaboration between our business, Milwaukee Tool, and Michigan Tech has been outstanding. We've made a number of concerted efforts to drive recruiting, to drive the corporate initiatives and the tie together. And I think what we saw today in some of the meetings we had is just further testament to the strength of that relationship. Okay, so now having said that, the obligatory thank yous over. Why Michigan Tech? I suppose probably for a lot of Michigan Tech alum that come out of the engineering or the technical programs, I was always hands-on growing up. It was Legos and Kinects and radio-controlled cars, and at 8 years old I installed AutoCAD R13 on the basement computer and racked up about $600 in long-distance charges to their IT support helpline on the landline. So for you young guys, we used to have corded phones. Used to be a thing. So when it came to college time, I was pretty fortunate in that had a mechanical engineer in the family, oceanic engineer, electrical engineer, and so was really privileged to always be steered towards engineering, and so it wasn't really any big surprise. I started to look at engineering schools, and then when I discover, not only is there this great engineering school way up in the northern tundra, but it also happens to own its own ski hill, I was pretty sold. Definitely it was definitely not for the girls, and it wasn't for the city party scene, to be sure. At the point I had to make that final decision, it seemed like there were so many just fortuitous, almost random conversations I would run into, sort of respected mentors in my life, and they would say things like, oh, my brother-in-law's sister's, cousin went to Michigan Tech, and, he's now the corporate vice president of this function at that company, and these conversations kept happening, and ultimately it just seemed like the logical fit. So I suppose in conclusion for me, it was a combination of the reputation of the university and just the location and small amount of the ski hill, for sure. Great.
Was there an experience or a professor that really stands out for you that you want to share with us, that influence?
So the politically correct question would be to name a professor and, throw out some accolades. But I'm going to take this in a different direction, which is the experience that I found most memorable was actually one that is remarkable, I think, for its almost utter and total lack of professor or administration oversight, and that's Winter Carnival. So let me first explain a little bit of context, okay? So for anybody in the audience that doesn't know where Houghton, Michigan is, you get on 41 North, you keep going, and you stop just before you fall into Lake Superior, okay? So there's about 200 inches of annual snowfall. It's cold, and the closest city with a population north of 1 million is about a 6-hour drive. Okay, so back in 1922, and I admit I had to look this up today to get the history right. Back in 1922, the university is, I'm not going to say 100% men, but certainly predominantly male. And the student body thinks, well, all right, it's cold, it's dark, we got a winter, let's make the best of it. What would be even better is if we could get our girlfriends to come up here. So to do that, they came up with this concept of Winter Carnival. And it consists of all manner of different events and so forth. But in 1934, the Michigan Tech chapter of the Buche Honor Society starts to run the event. And what's really remarkable here is not only the university, but effectively the entire Keweenaw economy rests their confidence in about 50 students annually, okay, that have a budget of something like $100,000 annual that turns into an economic impact annually of between $30 and $40 million. Okay, and I was one of those people, so I ran special events. What are special events, you might ask? Well, I direct your attention to the screens behind you, and it was my job, along with about 6 or 7 other students, to coordinate things like human ice bowling and broomball. What's broomball? Well, broomball is exactly what you see on the screen. It's a matter of hockey-esque, but minus the blades and the majority of the protective gear, and you hit a ball around with a broom that's been taped with a lot of duct tape. So, fantastically fun. You end up with a lot of bruises, but absolutely, I would say the experiences learned in leading a team, managing a budget, interacting with not only university, but community leaders, public safety, the police, that was my most memorable experience at Michigan Tech.
So let's go back to your beginning, right after you graduated. Can you tell us about what motivated you, what I call non-negotiables, when pursuing your first-time position?
Sure. So I graduated with my undergraduate in 2008, mechanical engineering, and the economy, first of all, made the decision for me because it fell apart. And so I figured, well, I guess I was going to go get my MBA at some point. Looks like I'm going to do that sooner than planned. So that was fine. So I was one of the, if not, actually, I think the inaugural MBA program. I might have been the very, very first class. So fast forward about 18 months, and now I start looking for that first opportunity out of school. And probably the biggest criteria for me at the time was looking for kind of the Goldilocks company, I called it. So I wanted a business that had sufficient scale, scope, opportunity, and particularly global opportunity, because I knew pretty early on I would likely build my career internationally. So you need a company that's big enough to have those, but not so big that you're just a number. So unlike probably most Michigan Tech graduates, at least from the mechanical engineering program, I shied away from the big automotive conglomerates. I knew that, hey, to go straight out of school, it'd be really hard to make an impact and a difference. And then I was very fortuitous that through a family business connection, I was led to, yes, an automotive business, but a small one at that, called Charter Manufacturing, which is based here in the Milwaukee area, and specifically the automotive division of that business, which was about a $50 million, $60 million top line. But what really attracted me is they had operations in the UK, and they'd had operations in China, and operations impending in Germany, for which I was promised an opportunity after I joined. And I'll come back to why that didn't exactly happen in just a minute, but I joined in the research and development segment of the business. So I was doing heat treatment and sort of steel chemistry interaction studies in this automotive business, and really kind of waiting for this opportunity in Germany to come through. So my non-negotiables were global scale, right size of the business to have opportunity, but also to be able to make a difference.
What series of events and actions led you to your current employer? Sure.
So as was just mentioned, I joined this company, Charter Automotive, and they said, well, we're buying this business in Germany, and we really need a young engineer with some German language skills, or at least some aptitude to go over and help integrate this business. So I join up, and about 2 weeks in, my manager calls me and he goes, well, you want the vegetables or do you want the dessert? Good news, bad news. And I go, well, okay, hit me with the vegetables. He goes, well, okay, so the deal in Germany is not happening. Oh, he goes, but we do have this loss-making facility in China. Do you want to give that a shot? And I'm like, that is not Germany at all. I don't speak Mandarin at all. I'm like, okay, where is it? And he goes, let's pull off the map, and it's literally in the middle of nowhere. It is a 5th-tier inland Chinese city in Anhui province called Wuhu. Despite the name, it was not fun at all. It was not a Wuhu kind of city. But I agreed to take the position, and I end up in Wuhu, Anhui, in China, at whatever I was, 22, 23 years old. and was basically challenged with turning around this about $50 million division of light manufacturing of valve keys, valve spring retainers, and it was a combination of being the turnaround guy at 22 or 23, managing staff that were 3 times my age, give or take, again in a foreign language. So it was a real quick crash course in senior leadership and business strategy and salesmanship. So I owned all these different pieces and actually did get the business turned around and profitable, wound down that division, simultaneously did a greenfield startup a little bit closer to Shanghai, because it's much easier to recruit talent when you're a little bit closer to a business. And ultimately then I moved back to Milwaukee. This opportunity I always wanted on the horizon in Germany, realized, okay, I'm gonna have to make that happen myself. And so I left the business, ended up in Germany working for, doing some consulting work for Hyundai Motorsports, designing some of the I-20 World Rally car, but principally as a student. And then I get a call from Tesla. And Tesla at the time, Elon was designing the, whatever it was, Model 3, Model S, don't recall, but he was looking for automotive engineers with a background in China. They flew me out to California. I go through all the interviews and had to write Elon, I'll never forget this, 2 essays, the first of which was literally, why are you good enough to work for me? Which I thought was awfully conceited, but credit to my mother. She goes, just, eat crow, write the essay, just do it. So I did. Got an offer, actually turned them down, and next day get a call from Apple, and it's a very tight networking, recruiting network out there, we'll say, and Apple basically same thing. We're looking for talented sort of operations, quality management folks that have lived and operated in China, and I go, okay, problem 1, I don't know anything about electronics. There's an irony there, obviously, given what I do today, but they said, no problem, we'll teach you the electronic side. So I joined as the head of global quality operations for the desktop business. So I had iMac, Mac Mini, Mac Pro, Foxconn, Quanta, Pegatron, Flex, all of the various major CMs. Moved around an awful lot. Every 3rd week I was back in China constantly. Racked up the majority of my now 1 million United miles in a about 18-month stretch of time. Got sick of it because the electronics space for me was not tangible. And I get a call from Scott Ertl, was the gentleman who was my first manager at the charter segment of my business, or charter segment of my career, who had in the intervening time joined Milwaukee Tool. And he goes, well, next time you're in town to visit your mom, why don't you come to Milwaukee and I'll give you the tour. And that was 10 years ago, and I was sold. So joined the accessories business unit originally, as a program manager to basically fast-track the development of all the carbide cutting products. So these were carbide circular blades, carbide recip blades, and so forth, to catch up to Bosch. And then over the next couple of years, had stints across product management, across channel management. We had a bit of a oopsie when we tried to launch a new warehouse system in our Olive Branch distribution center. Yeah, for those of you that are around, you remember those days. So spent a lot of my time in Olive Branch figuring out how do we right-size that system. And then, okay, now fast forward, President Trump comes into office, and you've got in 2018 the Section 301 tariffs, okay? So Section 301 comes out, the list one, and it affected about $34 billion in imports. It wasn't a significant impact, we'll say, to the typical American consumer at that point. But by September, we get list 3. And list 3 was kind of the economy killer. And it was $200 billion of total import impact, the vast majority of which of Milwaukee Tools, our products, were on that list. So within 60 days or so, we realized, okay, we need a very, very seriously aggressive strategy to try to mitigate these impacts. And I ended up then moving from Milwaukee over to Hong Kong, which resulted in my working for the parent corporation of Milwaukee Tool, which is Tektronix Industries, but at that time focused 100% on reconfiguring the Milwaukee supply chain. So hopefully that's not too boring. That's the pathway that has led me to the current.
And then the pandemic. How has it impacted you professionally? And tell us a little about your story and about how you reacted.
Sure. Yeah, so, a bit of an overview context. So, as you'll see behind me here, Tektronix Industries, as was mentioned, is the parent corporation to Milwaukee Tool. So, it is about $13.25 billion global organization, with the business brands, Milwaukee Tool being really the flagship. But Hoover, Homelight, Empire, Imperial, Auric Vax, a number of other brands and businesses that you see here across the professional and consumer and DIY, what we call do-it-yourself, power tools, hand tools, accessories, outdoor power equipment, storage and safety, floor care spaces. And as I was then in that role, and I think it was January 23rd, in Hong Kong of 2020, and I'm the director of sourcing for the Milwaukee Accessories business unit at that time, and we just come up upon Chinese New Year, and I go, guys and gals, great job this last year. Thanks for all your effort. Enjoy the time with your family and friends. We'll see you back here next week, Wednesday. Yeah. Okay, well, that didn't happen. So I get on the train, go back over the border south, and everyone is in a massive panic. And I don't speak Cantonese, and so I'm looking on the phone going, what's happening? And it's mysterious illness coming out of Wuhan, China. I go, oh shit, I was in Wuhan last week. That's bad. So start reading through this and realize, okay, we might have a wee bit of an issue here. And you have to recall that Hong Kong had SARS. And SARS was very serious and very, very deadly. And so the local population took COVID and the threat extraordinarily seriously, to the point where the government basically said, you've got 3 days to either choose to stay or leave the country. So at that point in time, I was married, had my little guy Huck and our dogs, and made the decision that, okay, my now ex-wife and my son would get on a plane, and my ex-wife preferred that I would stay and feed the dogs. So, rather than I guess save myself, it was more important to feed the dogs, so I stayed behind. And we had lockdowns, and then the country opened. I was able to leave, but then came back to the U.S., and it became apparent that might actually be safer in Hong Kong, with all the provisions, all the controls, all the safety, and so forth. So, there was a lot of uncertainty, I'll say early on, but some upside that would come as well.
So the day-to-day really brought you into some opportunities that you told us about. And how did you make those decisions to reach unmatched double-digit growth despite the global pandemic?
So, first I have to speak a little bit about Milwaukee Tool growth. So as you'll see behind me, the massive double-digit growth for Milwaukee well preceded the pandemic. So Milwaukee Tool has grown double digits for well over a decade. And the reason, or one of the principal reasons it's been able to achieve that growth, is our relentless focus on our professional end user. So what Milwaukee Tool does better than anybody else in our industry is we have an entire dedicated team of what we call job site solutions, as well as end user research, and it is their focus, go to that next one, Jen, it's their focus to call on these various vertical trade groups, so the mechanical, the electrical, the plumber, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, transportation maintenance. And what we want to do is we want to understand what it is that these professional users do from the time they get up in the morning throughout their day on the particular job site, and understand those pain points, challenges, and then ultimately present to them opportunities to drive productivity, to drive safety. So now we're something like third quarter, let's say 2020, we're coming into early 2021, and I would argue that what Milwaukee Tool did differently is actually the same as we'd always done, and it's listening to our end users. And by that point in time, most construction, most job sites were deemed essential, and therefore our end users were working, and what they needed more than anything was for us to continue to support them and provide tools and solutions and so forth. So we made the decision, we kept our factories running, and that resulted in first half of 2021, Milwaukee grew 54%, and then you'll see the full year 2021 was about 40%. And so I guess the tricky bit was having to now supply all of the critical product to be able to build tools at that kind of a growth rate. Okay. So a key differentiator for Milwaukee and a key driver of that historical growth has been our focus on disruptive innovation across what we call BEM, so batteries, electronics, and motors. And if you rewind to about the mid-2000s, about the 2005 era, Milwaukee Tool was the first global power tools business to put lithium-ion cells in a battery pack for a power tool application. No one at that point believed that lithium-ion cells could be stable enough for the kinds of applications in power tools. And truthfully speaking, the cells by themselves weren't stable. What Milwaukee Tool was able to do is develop all of the ecosystem, the electronics, both in the pack as well as on the tool and the charger, to both control the charge and the discharge in those cells such that you didn't have any kind of runaway events. So when you see these terrible, terrible videos of lithium-ion cells on fire, things like that, from the get-go, we designed the circuitry around the cells and packs and chargers such that that would never happen, okay? So if you kind of roll forward in time then, and as we start to really drive this innovation cycle beyond just the use of lithium-ion, we put things like Bluetooth low energy connectivity in our products, and then more power with bigger cells and bigger motors. And this is all incredibly chip or semiconductor intensive. And it wasn't just us that is semiconductor intensive. And as you start to look across the industry as a whole, and now people are home and buying devices in combination with 5G rollout and vehicle electrification, what you're seeing behind you is this sort of cyclical nature of the semiconductor industry, and you see that line going up and down. I won't bother explaining the differences in those two colors of lines. The key one to pay attention to is that green dotted line, which is about that 92%. What that basically means is anywhere those two lines fluctuate above that 92%, it means you're now in shortage and allocation, and nobody, generally speaking, is going to get all of the chips or all the content that they want. So we have this unprecedented confluence of demand. There's been a long-term trend at that point of underinvestment in the kinds of capacity that the industry needs to support the demand. And so when you have massive ramp up in demand and you have flat supply, it's not a real complicated equation. You get allocations, you get lengthy lead times, and ultimately shortages and some disappointed consumers. And so at that point in time, the business feels like it's a really good challenge. So I get promoted as Vice President of Global Electronic Sourcing for TTI, supporting all the global business units to go fix the chip crisis. Lucky me, all right?
Tell us a little more about your strategy and where you found this confidence to tackle those problems.
Sure. So it starts with, as I have generally found in my career, with asking a lot of questions and listening. So regardless of the challenge, whether in this case it was the semiconductor shortage and the chip crisis, you have to ask questions because you have to understand what's the current state to be able to answer questions in our sphere. Things like, well, how did we select electronic components, and who are the key partners? What were the criteria for these things? How did we forecast? How do we place orders? How do we verify? All of these kinds of operational and sort of tactical questions. But again, it really starts with listening and then mapping out the current state of where you are, identifying potential solutions, and then you create a strategy around that change management. So I'll save you the question. So what's the strategy you followed, Heath? Well, it's a simple strategy. And my team is groaning because they've seen this probably 5 million times over the last 2 years. But I'm going to go through it again because it's simple and it's worth understanding. So it's a strategy of a 4-part pillar. It's people, behavior, systems, and relationships. So people, many of whom on my team are here in the audience, and thanks guys for coming. So when I was given the opportunity for this role, my boss, Nate Easter, who's our Chief Procurement Officer, says, good luck to you. And I go, okay, well, Nate, how many people do I have? And he goes, well, you got one guy. His name is Sandeep, and he lives in Ohio. You should call him. And I'm like, one guy? Okay, $500 million, give or take, and spend? I'm like, we're screwed. Like, there is no way we're going to fix this. But The people part of this was an early understanding from my senior leadership, from our CEO across the business, that we needed to scale the people very quickly. So we went on effectively a hiring spree and scaled the team from Sandeep and myself, the 1+1, to what is today over a 40-person global team distributed among Hong Kong, South China, Mexico, the U.S., and within the U.S., different business units that we support. So the people was a key piece. Behavior, we historically, both Milwaukee Tool as well as our other business units, are the fastest in our industry at product launch. So Milwaukee Tool is very, very admirable. We'll say something between 12 to 18 months of sort of front-end concept development to launch. Our cousins, we'll call them, at our Ryobi business unit can do that in some cases as fast as 6 months. Okay, how do you launch a product now in 6 months when your lead times for your critical components are now in excess of 52, 54, 60 weeks? How do you do that? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, you really can't. And you had to reconcile the reality, the new reality that we're living in, with the sales force and the engineering, and get them to kind of change the behavior and work in concert and collaboratively. We had to start designing not to what we wanted, but to the products we had and that were available. So that was a key piece. And then systems was, I'll talk about that in a minute, but basically the digital infrastructure build out. I'll come back to that in a little bit. And then the last piece there is relationships. And relationships is all about the personal connection, because at the end of the day here, your spend dollars and the technology, these are all key things, but it's about people at the end of the day, and people making decisions because they maybe have a mutual respect, and ultimately are collaborative to drive business together. So it's a simple strategy. I'm reminded, kind of in closing to this question, John Sculley, who was the CEO of Apple before Jobs took back over, and he said, you don't really understand something complex unless you can explain it to your grandmother. That might be a bit offensive, I think. I had a smart grandma. I know you're a smart grandma as well. But that's the point. If you can't explain a strategy simply and succinctly, you probably don't get it. So that's the answer to that question.
Now, I'm sure that our audience would like to know your perspective on the future outlook of the industry. Could you share a few predictions with us?
Sure. Well, very, very simplistically, let's go to the next slide, that guy. So I'll break this down. This is the most detailed chart of the evening. So what we're looking at here is basically, and kudos to Texas Instruments. Thank you. Stole this from them. That's a great slide, though. So what we're looking at here is, going back to the early 90s, billions of units of semiconductors shipped. And obviously you'll notice that curve continues to go up. The red diamonds on this curve are the peaks of every one of these semiconductor or chip cycles. So this is a very cyclical industry. It goes from peak to trough, peak to trough. Okay, so our last peak, where we all experienced an inability to buy the goods, buy the car, or buy the power tools that you wanted, the peak of that demand cycle was in March of 2022. If you go back and you look at roughly the last 20 years, the average time in months between those peak demands is about 40. Okay, so if you take March of 2022, you project into the future, give or take 40 months. I'm not going to bet my entire career on it, but sometime November 2025, plus or minus 6 months, you're going to be at a next peak demand. And that next peak demand will have grown in excess of 20% from what we saw the last go around. So let's go to the next slide. So now we go up 20%, okay? Here's the problem. The global capacity for the what we call nodes, and I'll spare you the boring explanation, but I've circled the colors. So if you just look at those three rightmost bars, the purple, the teal, and the red, you'll notice that those are not growing substantially. And basically what this means is we have, roughly speaking, around 36-ish months at this point to grow the capacity on a global basis about 22% to avoid shortages, and that is not happening. There's one supplier that I know of, and I'm not saying this just because you're in the room to Tish, but there's one supplier domestically that is adding massive capacity because they see the same thing, but on a global basis, it is not an area of growth and investment because, frankly speaking, it's less lucrative. So the CHIPS Act and things like that you hear in the news cycle, Those guys, the Intels and the Samsungs of the world, are getting dollars to invest in those blue bars on the left. And that's why you're seeing that grow massively. That is not where any of the shortages occurred. So again, your inability to buy, the car that you wanted, your KitchenAid devices, anything like that, those were on the right side. So here's my prediction. We are going to see shortages again. They will likely be worse than the last go around, at least in industrial type products. But I also predict that our business, TTI Milwaukee, is going to be absolutely ready. We're going to kick ass and we're going to grow 40% again.
Great. What innovations, so you talked a bit about this, how do they relate to insourcing and your current processes?
Yeah, the innovations are happening now, and it's what I alluded to earlier. It's a massive investment in digital infrastructure, and basically what that means is bolting together the various software systems that businesses need to be able to accurately forecast, to be able to understand things like, where is inventory, where is backlog, am I going to likely get the parts that I need when I need them, plus or minus a certain degree of accuracy. So the innovations aren't just happening in semiconductor, they're happening supply chain wide, and it's a massive, massive investment in eliminating ambiguity is probably the best way I would say it. So within our business, another acute example is we've bolted together our front-end PCBA, or our circuit board assembly design software, and we're integrating that all the way through our process, through our ERP systems, through our forecasting, such that when the next shortage crisis hits, we can take a finished goods forecast. So somebody wants to buy, a Home Depot, for example, wants to buy Milwaukee tools in such and such quantity. We will at that point in time be able to tell our suppliers we need exactly this level of components in this quantity, again at this point in time, plus or minus a degree of accuracy. It's something that not only we but a number of our other competitors couldn't do historically. So that's really the main driver of future innovation that we're seeing, digital systems and integration.
This is a really timely question. How do you envision artificial intelligence and machine learning, those investments at Milwaukee Tools overall, and specifically, how are they impacting the supply chain?
I'll talk more, the machine learning stuff within the tools is probably the more exciting and the more readily understandable. So to set some context a little bit, the average so we talked about our professional user groups earlier, the mechanical, electrical, plumber, and so forth. The average now U.S. wage rate of those professionals in a we'll call it a first or second tier city. So, for example, like a San Francisco is north of $100 an hour now. Okay, it's very, very expensive professional labor. It is very difficult to get apprentices and to get young workers into these professions, okay? So you put those two things together and you've got to figure out a way to drive significant improvements in productivity. One example, Rosen & Electric, who is the country's largest electrical contractor, we're talking over 5,000 electrical contractor employees, they had about 11 million labor hours of work 2 years ago. That number, with backlog, their work that they've already contracted in 2025 needs to grow to 20 million. 11 to 20 in about 3 years. Okay, they're not hiring 9 million more people worth of labor hours. So when you look at a company like Milwaukee Tool, it's our job to figure out how do we bridge that gap, and it's through enhanced productivity. So where machine learning comes in is, imagine a world in the not so distant future where the tool happens to know the types of materials that it's engaging with, right? And it can optimize in, let's say, the context of cutting. If you're cutting through a stainless steel or a black pipe, that's a very different type of speed and feed versus what would happen in, let's say, wood or PVC. You can basically take the additional necessity of training out of the worker's hands. You can now provide them a tool in the distant future via machine learning that has the capability to detect, to adapt, and improve overall productivity. So that's probably the more concrete example of machine learning within Milwaukee Tool. Certainly on the supply chain side, what I mentioned earlier, things like forecasting, digital systems integration, we're going to take more of the guesswork out because the machine learning and the algorithms come in and are going to be better predictors of what we need when we need it. then relying on maybe junior product managers to do their own forecasting. Everyone loves their own product. They think it's going to sell a lot better than it actually will. We're going to be able to aggregate big data and actually use data to have better prediction than we do today.
So we've talked about materials and operations. Let's move to sourcing talent. So having the right skills and the right roles is crucial for your corporate success. Do you have some recommendations for strategic hiring in the post-pandemic era?
Yeah. So I think when we reflect on, as a business, some of the learnings that came out of the pandemic and a big driver, as I mentioned, of our success, and we'll show it here with the culture wheel, is both the culture, but then more principally the people that embody that culture. So it's absolutely crucial as part of our hiring practices that we find people that not only embody and exemplify these types of cultural attributes, but we have to give them also a really good experience in the hiring journey. So unfortunately, much of what happens today is, for those of you that have gone out and done some job seeking recently, you come to a great job and an opportunity that you really like, and it says, submit your resume here. Great. You submit your resume, and then you got to go fill out the 20-question survey that was all the stuff that was on your resume. Like, that's completely disintegrated. It's a horrible hiring experience. So Milwaukee takes very, very seriously streamlining that process, trying not to upset a potential candidate before they even get a chance to get a foot in the door. So once you now have identified somebody that you think is maybe worthwhile of an interview, we are very, very well calibrated on the process and the questions by which we evaluate things like culture. So we can train for skill sets, okay? Obviously, yes, there has to be in a particular role or opportunity a specific, baseline of we'll say technical or competency, but generally we're really hiring for culture. So we really are tight in terms of the cross-functional interview committees that we structure. We enable those very fast. We can spin up interviews quite quickly. And yeah, we're really asking questions that drill into these kinds of things. So we talked about this today on a tour with the Michigan Tech folks. Tell me about a time you've had to deliver bad news to a superior. Tell me about a time you had to, for example, pivot a project in a much more agile manner. And by drilling in, we understand whether somebody's going to be a cultural fit. So it's the reason that we've been able to grow double digit. It hasn't obviously slowed down, as was mentioned during pandemic, growing 40%. I think another thought is, while a lot of industries have unfortunately laid off quite a bit during the pandemic, what has the benefit, I suppose, to Milwaukee Tool is we've seen a massive influx now and even additional potential talent. So it reinforces the need for us to be even more diligent, more streamlined, as we've gotten literally thousands of resumes a day that have to be screened through. And I think we've done a pretty admirable job there. So yeah, a combination of a couple of things, definitely cultural attributes and making sure the recruiting / interview process is very, very streamlined.
Talent acquisition is becoming highly competitive, so it's not just your company, but competition worldwide. Do you have some suggestions for employee retention and also recruitment, and what should we be considering?
Sure. So both are obviously equally important, right? It's two sides of the same coin, and the way at least Milwaukee looks at it is, if we spend a ton of time on the front end and doing the recruiting and the hiring and the training only to lose that person, well, that wasn't really effort and money and time and so forth well spent, right? So we also invest an extraordinary amount in retention, and we do that through a couple of different strategies. We're invested, I would say, first and foremost in well-being, okay? And it sounds really soft and fuzzy, well-being, yeah, we have great health insurance and benefits and all those things. Beyond that, though, it really means recognizing that every individual likely has a different set of circumstances, okay? And things like, an opportunity to, let's say, work in a more flexible environment or have opportunities, if needed, to relocate down the road. Those are all things that our HR team looks at very, very seriously. Certainly you have to, I think, have improve yourself and earn that credibility. But we believe that, treating individuals very positively, having very, very strong, I would say, senior level to working population interactions. One thing that we do different than, frankly, any other business I've worked for is very regular, at least once, if not several times a quarter, addresses to all of the global Milwaukee Tool working population, from Steve Richman, from our CEO, Joe Galley. We talk about what's happened in the business, what's going well, and frankly, we're very transparent and honest. We'll talk about what's not going well and where the challenges might be, and I think it rallies everybody together. So those are some key points. Career advancement, the great thing about a growing business, when you grow roughly 20% every year, is it creates opportunity. It creates opportunity. I'm an example of that. Somebody that went from an engineering role within accessories to product management, product marketing, distribution, to sourcing, to purchasing, tactical procurement, now running a global electronic sourcing business for TTI. So keeping individuals interested in employees and opportunity is essential, we'll say, to the recruitment side of that question.
Can you explain why Michigan Tech graduates are so appealing to your company and what makes them unique?
Absolutely, yeah, we're cold resistant, number one, right? So that's the key thing. You got to have people that can deal with Milwaukee and Chicago. So kidding aside, right? Yes, that is actually important. I'm not going to lie, because when you tell people, for example, from Stanford, where Milwaukee is, it's a bit of a tougher sell, okay? I say that jokingly, but it actually is indeed a bit of a tougher sell. So Michigan Tech students, yes, that is a little bit of it, but that's a small piece of it. Milwaukee loves Michigan Tech grads because they come with an almost innate work ethic. It is obviously a faraway campus. You only go there, generally speaking, if you're very serious about the academics, and there's sort of this innate organic emphasis on real work. When it is 20 below zero in January and you still need to trek to your 8 a.m. physics class, that teaches you something about the importance of dedication and work, and we see that come through. Now, it's obviously also one of the best engineering schools, but beyond that now, what I've seen in the last 15, 20 years is the integration of the business savviness and, for example, the College of Business, the College of Computing, into recognizing that we're now living in a world that is not siloed among just engineering and business and computing. All of these things are merging, okay? They are all cross-pollinating, and so having students that have a great degree of flexibility makes them ideal candidates for Milwaukee.
What advice would you have for the students? So talk right to them and tell them what they need to prepare for.
Yeah. So first thing is I was fortunate to have a great mentor when I was not even quite out of college yet, and he said, okay, Heath, first thing you need to understand is your network is your net worth. And that's something that has always resonated with me. So like tonight, as example, it is very important to build connections across businesses, across industries, even within your own company. I've already met individuals tonight that work at Milwaukee whom I've never had an opportunity to meet. So once you understand that building your network is crucial, don't be afraid to leverage that network. If you need to ask for favors, do it. If you need to ask for new opportunities, do it. Also be ready to give back. For example, the most, I think, rewarding thing I get to do is mentor young students, young professionals, some of whom are sitting in the audience here. I agree to speak at things like Traveling Tech Talks. So, you always have to give back, but then not be afraid to ask as well. I think beyond, that piece of advice, it's understanding that the world has changed. We live in an ever more digitally connected, again, cross-functional sort of world. So don't stay siloed. Always be intellectually curious and go after and understand different areas that might be outside your traditional area of expertise.
That's great. For now, we're going to hold the last question, and we'd like to spend some time with you asking questions of Heath. So we have some microphones, and please don't be shy.
Thank you. Heath, I'm curious how Milwaukee balances lean concepts and just-in-time delivery with keeping inventory on hand. And it's...
Sure. No, great question. Very astute. So yeah, us, just like a lot of the other predominantly, we'll call them Asia manufacturing businesses, adopted in some ways JIT and lean inventory. I would say where Milwaukee historically, pre-pandemic, was a differentiator is we looked at inventory as our CEO uses the term, we like to weaponize inventory. So we were actually fortunate in that we carried something between around 5 to 6 months of excess, I shouldn't call it excess, of strategic component inventory even before we had the massive ramp up in demand. The good news for us is that's how we were able to grab a lot of that early market share, but we burned through we burned through all of that, I shouldn't say excess, we burned through all of that strategic inventory reserve, and now the big question in the business is what do we do going forward? What is the right level of inventory to set, and how do we set it? And that falls on largely myself and my counterparts in supply chain at the finished goods level. And we've all kind of agreed that something around 6 months of inventory is the right number to carry in some of these very strategic, critical electronic components. We're happy now to sit on well in excess of a year. Because the demand, it only takes one component for you to not build a board, to not build a product, to not be able to ship. So carrying a higher level of inventory than we would have been comfortable with historically seems to be the right strategic decision going forward. Question there? Oh, okay.
Did your sourcing strategy team have any impact on manufacturing operations processes? Like, were you able to drive scrap and rework process differently, or change the order of operations on the floor?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're getting to the level of sophistication now where, yes, we are starting to have more of an impact in manufacturing, but I'll answer it slightly different. We're driving changes in manufacturing by optimizing the upstream. And what I mean by that is what we learned early on is when an engineer, and I'm not picking on anybody in the room, right, but when an engineer historically within Milwaukee would select a component, they were doing so largely on the basis of that particular component's suitability for the technical or the engineering application, okay? And there wasn't really a question asked as to, is this optimized for manufacturing, or more specifically, is it, I'll just say generically, supply chain friendly? Can we get this thing in the volumes we need when we need it? So what my organization has done is now become a service organization, we'll say, to the global engineering groups, and when they want to go use something new, novel, maybe not yet released to market, they come to my group, and my group advises and goes, well, hold on, yes, that might be the ideal, but let me go run that down for you. Let me go have the conversations with our semiconductor chip manufacturing partners. Maybe we already have a solution sitting in the warehouse that's just as optimal from an engineering or technical standpoint, but we've already got it. So we're fixing the very front end of the component selection decisions that in turn optimize the manufacturability and reduce the ultimate risk in the supply chain. So we're building in resilience and redundancy, we'll say, from the very, very front end. We're not yet at a point where my group is really touching the actual like SMT or the final assembly test, anything like that. That's really not where we yet play. Don't need to get there yet.
I'm going to apologize for the length of the question because it'll take a little bit to explain it. In Elon Musk's interview 24 or 48 hours ago, he commented about how the Chinese economy and the world economy, the U.S. economy and the world economy are at best considered conjoined twins with an absolutely mind-blowing possibility of splitting them up. And that survival is just non-existent, my words, as opposed to his. Mm-hmm. Given that sort of global political scenario, and you've changed the timeline of introducing the functional capability of a chip has now been changed from roughly 18 to 20 months to about 4 months, given the new software capabilities. You're looking at an acceleration in modified chip structure, where we're used to a pipeline system changing over to a inference system for artificial intelligence, but also to your point about understanding the tool and what it's dealing with. But as this, when you put up your chip slide, I don't know if your person can do it, your curve looked a little low.
Yeah, potentially so, right.
Yeah,
right.
And the question is, how do you change the organization around when your parameters outside that, and that curve changes, let's say by 3% or 5%, and gets that much steeper? Or worse yet, if somebody like the Intel chairman or the TSMC chairman decide to accelerate the onboarding of fab plants. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Intel project to have 8 fabs up in Ohio was to run through 25 or 26. They've already hit the 25 deadlines. So they're more than a year ahead. That's going to change the marketplace. How do you adapt to the change of the curve?
Yeah, so I'll kind of maybe answer the end one going back. So you have to, again, recognize that there are there's obviously verticals and sub-segments within the semiconductor industry, right? So TSMC, Samsung, Intel are all investing at, generally speaking, 7 nanometer and below. So for the general audience, what that basically means is when you think of a semiconductor, the most basic explanation is that the circuits and pathways, when we talk about node or geometry, what we're talking about is what is the minimal distance between those pathways. Okay, it's a bit of an oversimplification. The distance is measured in billionths of a meter. That's a nanometer, okay? Generally speaking, the closer those things are together, the more sophisticated, if you will, and the more efficient that those chips are. They also are more expensive, okay? And because they're more expensive, it means that the chip guys can charge more for them and generate more margin. So when you talk about TSMC, Samsung, Intel, that is where they are investing. Now, the differentiator, as I mentioned, is the vast majority of increase in chip demand is not necessarily going to happen at those leading technologies. Yes, there are certain nodes there that are much more adaptable and we'll say conducive to things like AI. But when you look at the massive pervasion, again, Milwaukee Tool is an example, our chip content and the pervasion is happening at 40 nanometer and above.
The old plant
Yes.
is what's going to be flooding, quote, your market.
Yes. Yes.
That old chip plant that is not the leading edge is what's going to be flooding the industrial / auto / factory floor market.
So
It's going to change that curve.
but they're not going to be flooding the market because the problem is there's not significant enough investment in those lagging geometries, those lagging nodes, 3, 4, 5 generations back. There is insufficient capacity that's being invested to even satisfy just one of the major demands, which is electric vehicles. So if you look at electric vehicles, the semiconductor content today in an IC engine, correct me here, you're looking at about $250, $300, okay? It's 4x that when you look at an EV, and that's just the vehicle.
It's also changed format from a silicon spacer to a silicon carbide. So it's a different manufacturing process.
Yes and no, but now we're talking power management and silicon carbide versus silicon, yes. But if you just talk about the number of chip content, so simplification for manufacturing of semiconductors, you're basically using a what's called a wafer. It's a very, very thin piece of silicon or silicon carbide. There's other variations, but simplistically, it's just how many of these tiny little chips can you cut out of something that's a 300 millimeter, generally speaking, wafer. So again, the geometries, though, that we really are going to need are not at that cutting edge yet. So we have definitely the industry recognizes there's been underinvestment there because that's not really where they make money. Now, interestingly, we have a representative from Texas Instruments in the room today, and they are one of the companies that is investing in a massive way domestically to try to meet the needed node geometries and we'll call them legacies. So we know there's going to be shortages. To go to your other comments there, the China versus the U.S., there is no potential reality where the one exists without the other. And that's the truth, right? TSMC has about a, roughly speaking, 20% global market share. So Taiwan, not necessarily the mainland, right? But about a 20% global market share in raw semiconductor output. If in the, I think, highly unlikely, but need to potentially consider situation where China were to invade Taiwan and the mainland, it would be a catastrophic incident for the global economy. It would shut everything down really quick. The good news is the Chinese recognize that, and therefore seems quite unlikely to happen. Did I give you enough of a flavor to your question there, hopefully? Okay.
Right, before we get started, Heath, this has been so exciting. I don't want to make it extra exciting. Get close to the edge on the back corner of your chair.
Oh, great.
So you're getting close.
All right, I'm just, that's a heavy chair. Okay, go that way.
But I don't want to say real great, all right? So I think, again, we've got time for one more question,
okay.
Everybody. So one more, we'll turn it over here. Let's see, it's on. Yeah, there you go.
So this question is from the guy from Ohio, as Heath explained it.
Guy from Ohio.
So a little expanding on the technology and innovation, which you mentioned rightfully that Milwaukee and TTI relentlessly go after and have been developing over the years. So my question is more towards, if you look into where the technology and the innovation is driving the consumer behavior and more towards more eco-friendly technologies or products. So as a key example, in the automotive sector, things are moving more towards EV. Everybody knows that's not the future, more clean energy. In context of the Milwaukee Tool products, specifically power tools and outdoor products, lawnmowers and others, given the way the US regulatory changes are happening in terms of more promoting clean energy, basically converting gas products into more lithium-ion or clean energy devices, how do you see in the next 5 to 10 years Milwaukee Tool, TTI is positioned towards leveraging that growth with respect to all the system improvements, people behavior, and weaponization of inventory that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure.
So if you can give a little flavor, appreciate it.
Sure. So a couple of points there. So from a government sort of municipality perspective is just one example. California next year outlaws the sale of small outdoor gas engine product. Okay, so if you are in California, you will not be able to go buy a gas-powered string trimmer, gas-powered blower, gas-powered leaf black. Okay, done. That is forcing, obviously, then the change into lithium-ion cordless powered outdoor power equipment. That is just one municipality, but I can bet you in the next 5 to 10 years, what is happening in California is starting to march across the country. So there is going to be government regulation that mandates the conversion into clean outdoor power equipment. That's going to be TTI, that's going to be Milwaukee. I think even more importantly, though, and probably a faster conversion, is just the overall level of convenience that the outdoor power equipment has when you no longer have to deal with the complexity and frustration of mixing gas. We all live in Wisconsin here, right? You leave your chainsaw in the garage over winter and you go to fire it up in March to do some spring cleanup, and what do you know, the carburetor's gummed up, it doesn't work. You don't have that problem with battery product. You slap a battery in the chainsaw, you slap a battery in the string trimmer, and guess what? It works. That is a major differentiator because it's a convenience factor that gas can't match. So I think individuals are going to continue to adopt more of the technology because of the convenience standpoint. Yes, you're going to have the government tailwinds, we'll say, helping us convert. You asked a question about more of the user side. Yeah, absolutely. There are big contractors that have, just like TTI, big ESG goals, environmental sustainability governance goals, and they have to figure out a way to reduce, for example, their annual carbon output and emissions. We are partnering with a lot of these larger contractors to put electrification at the forefront of that strategy to help them drive those transitions. So combination of all of those things, we're certainly well positioned to, as you know, continue to drive a lot of growth and take a lot of market share.
So as we wrap up, you're going to have a chance to tell us a little bit about what your education at Michigan Tech means to you and your career.
Well, I'm glad I went. So obviously it set me on a pathway here, I think, more than anything, to be a problem solver. I think what you learn at Michigan Tech is, sure, there's a lot of difficult exams, and as I mentioned, you learn a lot about time management, but I think in aggregate what you're learning really is problem solving and how to interact as I mentioned, sort of this cross-functional, ever-evolving and ever-complex world. And that's the benefit, and that's what it means to me.
And we want to thank you for your time and
Thank
all
you
your
all.
comments
Appreciate
and insights.
your attendance, everyone. Thank you.